Hi, I'm Congressman Eric Burlison. You know, a lot of conversations are happening in Washington, D.C. right now with words that a lot of people are not familiar with. Words like reconciliation, deficits, debt. And so I wanted to create this video to kind of give a picture of where we're at and what the battle that's happening right now in Washington, D.C. So let's start with our expenditures. Right now, we spend, as a federal government, almost $7 trillion in expenditures. That is mostly in mandatory spending. 4.1 trillion is in mandatory spending, which is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. There's also discretionary spending, which is what most people think of when they think of the federal government. Prisons, the national parks, and including our defense for our military. That's all discretionary spending. And then you have interest payments on the national debt. So right now we're at 36.5 trillion in debt. That is the highest debt to GDP since World War II. And because of that, the interest payments that we're paying on that 36.5 trillion is almost $1 trillion a year. In fact, it's this year we're spending more for the first time ever on interest payments on the debt than we are on our own defense spending. Okay, so here's the problem. We're spending $6.7 trillion a year, but we're only bringing in five. We're bringing in $5 trillion. We bring it in through corporate taxes, payroll taxes, and income taxes. The other taxes, I believe, are tariffs. So that leaves us with an almost $2 trillion a year deficit. The difference between how much we are bringing in tax revenue versus how much we spend, that is what is the deficit. This is annually. So we're adding to that $36 trillion debt, 1.8, almost $2 trillion every single year. And of the revenues, we're bringing in individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, and other. That's bringing in the $5 trillion. This is just a breakdown of that. So over time, our deficits have exceeded our revenues. And we've never been worse than we have, over the last 50 years than we are today. So right now, on average, we are having a 6.4% of the GDP is the deficit. So we're at a deficit of 6.4% of our GDP. The average of the previous 50 years is right under 4. So we're spending a great deal more, and our deficit is a great deal more than it has been in over 50 years. And because of that, we are seeing the results. So as we get less and less money to work with, as we spend more and more on interest payments, we're seeing that we have less money to spend on things like the defense. This is not a good thing. We hit this inflection point where we're spending more in interest payments than defense, and it's only going to get worse. So the worse financial situation that we continue to be in, the less we're going to have a strong military. So the question is at hand with the reconciliation, because in reconciliation, you can't talk about it's not discretionary spending. It's only about mandatory spending. So within mandatory spending, again, that is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and welfare benefits mostly. And so where's the bulk of that? Most of it is in Medicare and Social Security. But then Medicaid is the third, where we spend nearly almost $620 billion every year on Medicaid currently. That's anticipated to continue to go up. Another thing I'll highlight is that the income security programs, they call it that. That's just a fancy word for welfare. So the welfare programs that we're spending include the SNAP program, I still call them food stamps. We're spending over almost $110 billion every year on those programs. Earned income child tax credits and supplemental Social Security income as well. Now, since the pandemic occurred, things have gone through the roof. So during COVID, as we all know, the federal government started spending a lot more money than it normally did. In fact, where we are today at 2024, we're spending 140% more on Social Security than we did pre-COVID. We're spending 235% more today on the interest on the national debt than we did pre-COVID. We're spending 141% more today than we did on Medicare, and we're spending 151% on Medicaid than we did before, and 126% in defense. And as you can see, as the years go on in the next 10 years, it's only going to get worse. So welfare spending, this is specifically the welfare programs, have exploded over since the pandemic, since COVID. And we've never returned to pre-COVID policies or expenditures. So what is being proposed? All of that doesn't even take into consideration that we have in front of us a proposal to extend the Trump tax cuts, which I'm all for, to cut taxes on tips, to cut taxes on Social Security, to cut taxes on overtime pay. These are all great ideas that I would support, but this would only make things worse. So the numbers are, just to extend the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, somewhere between $4 trillion and $4.8 trillion over the next 10 years. That's the cost. SALT, if our New York friends and California friends that like their SALT tax, they want that deduction raised, the cap, if they're able to get that, it's anywhere between $200 billion cost and $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. And so as you can see, if we cut taxes on tips, it's between $100 billion, $500 billion. No taxes on overtime pay, between $250 billion and $3 trillion. Social Security, the cost would be between half a trillion dollars and $1.5 trillion. So this is the cost, because when you cut taxes, at the end of the day, you are going to get some economic growth, and we'll talk about that, but you're not going to pay. They don't pay for themselves. So here's the problem. Where we are right now, we're at 100% of our debt to GDP. I've talked about that. This is the worst point that we've been since World War II. If we implement all of the tax cuts on the high side, we're looking at growing over the next 10 years to being 150% of our debt to GDP. This is game over. This is where this level means you have to restart as a national currency. It means your retirement funds will default. We will be in a debt spiral that we will not be able to get out of. This is not good. On the low side, it'll be 132%. This is still debt spiral territory, okay? And I would submit that if we do nothing, if we don't extend the Trump tax cuts, we don't do anything, on our current trajectory, we are still on trajectory to be at 118% of our debt to GDP, which is also unsustainable and approaching a debt spiral. So where do we find the money? As we talked about in the mandatory spending programs, that's the only thing that you can do in reconciliation. The big ticket item is Medicaid. And for all the talk about that the Democrats have about cutting Medicaid, this is why they're completely wrong and why it's false. And you can tell them that. Because currently we spend $700 billion. That's our baseline on Medicaid. If we had never expanded, if we'd never implemented the policies of Joe Biden, we wouldn't be spending $700 billion. We'd be spending somewhere between $500 billion and $600 billion on the Medicaid population. But because he changed a bunch of policies, including eliminating the Bill Clinton work requirement rules, including the eliminating all of the waivers for these states, it's allowed for the spending to explode. This includes not requiring people to actually recertify that they even qualify for Medicaid. So this is where we're at. By re-implementing some of these rules over a slow period of time, including the work requirements, including making people have to recertify that they even qualify for Medicaid, over a 10-year period, eventually we will return to the original baseline. During that period of time, that 10 years, we will go from spending $700 billion to spending over $900 billion. So explain to me how an increase over 10 years of $200 billion in a program is somehow cutting the program. It's not. We're returning to sanity. We're returning to the way things were before COVID and everybody went crazy. So this is a chart that talks about the fact that Joe Biden's rules have put a lot of people that would have previously not qualified for Medicaid, the able-bodied working population, the young working population, and people that are not recertifying they're well into the enrollment. In fact, it far exceeds the poverty rate. So here's the situation that we have with Medicaid. It used to be in 1988 that about 5 people were paying for one person's Medicaid benefits. By 2004, it was 3 people paying for one person's Medicaid benefits, and now it's 1.7. 1.5 people are paying for one person's Medicaid benefits. Again, this is not sustainable. So when we talk about Medicaid and where the money is spending, this is probably the most important thing to understand. Originally, Medicaid was intended for the disabled, for children, and for pregnant moms. It was intended for the elderly in a nursing home, right? So this is the population that Medicaid was focused on. And for every $1 that a state spends on this population, it forces the federal government to match that and pay 1.33, okay? So for every $1, we're spending 1.33 from the federal level, which means in total, the spend on them is 2.33. Now, let's talk about this individual. This is a young person. This is someone between the ages of 18 and 60. This individual is not disabled. They're not a child. They're not a pregnant mom. This is a working age adult that should be working. And under Bill Clinton required this person to demonstrate that they're at least trying to get a job. The Bill Clinton work requirement rules. Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who supported these rules, said this individual, if they're going to school to try to get a job, or they are spending 20 hours a week applying for jobs, or they're working and they're just still not making enough money to support themselves, then they would qualify for Medicaid. But that's the way things used to be, because now they've waived all those requirements. So this individual can still stay at home, not get a job, not even try to get a job, and we have to pay for their healthcare benefits. And so this individual who should be working to support the disabled, the children, and the pregnant moms, this individual is not. And we're paying for that person to stay home for their healthcare benefits. And so the problem is that it creates a perverse incentive. Let's go back to that chart. So the problem is when they expanded Obamacare and under the Biden policy changes, instead of doing a 1 to 1.3 match, the federal government, the match is for every dollar that the state spends, we have to spend 9. So a state like California, and I'll get to California soon, can spend $1 and force the federal government to spend $9 on the able-bodied young working age population. So now that's where we are with, that's what they call FMAP. So you have the states that chose not to expand into that able-bodied working age adult population. They're, again, spending on average 1.3, or we are spending 1.3 for every $1 they spend. And then the result is that the total spend is 2.3. But when it comes to the able-bodied population, the state spends $1, we have to spend 9. We're spending $10 per individual more that is an able-bodied worker than somebody that's disabled. This is when people talk about FMAP and fixing that match. This is what has to be fixed, and I'll show you exactly why. California figured this out, that they can force the federal government to spend $9 for every $1 that it spends, and they're using it to launder money. And this is the way they do it. And it costs no money to California because they raise taxes on managed care companies, the companies that are providing Medicaid. So they go to these companies and say, we're going to tax you, but don't worry, we're going to give you all of the money that we just taxed you right back. But in the meantime, we're going to take that money and we're going to pull down federal dollars, and that'll let us have more money so that we can spend it on expanding the population for Medicaid and spend it on illegal immigrants. In fact, this scheme has allowed California to spend nearly $4 billion to put illegal immigrants to pay for illegal immigrants to have Medicaid. $4 billion. This is crazy. And this total scheme is spending more money in federal dollars in California that we send in federal dollars than the entire state of Florida spends in 1 year in their entire annual budget. So this is absurd. This has to be corrected. California is stealing federal dollars, and they're rubbing our noses in it by paying for illegal immigrants and encouraging them to come over here. So the other program that we're looking at when it comes to reconciliation is the cost of the green energy tax credits. So when you hear people talk about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, this was never about inflation. It was about the Green New Deal. And so all of it are programs that were designed to give tax credits to solar companies, to give tax credits to utilities that install solar and wind, or to individuals who want to install solar in their home, to give tax credits for people that want to buy an electric vehicle, EV charging stations, yada, yada, yada. All of that garbage is in the IRA, and that's the green energy scam. We can cut that potentially and have tremendous savings because the cost, which was originally estimated when they passed the IRA, the CBO scored it at $250 billion. That's a joke. Even CBO corrected themselves in 1 year and doubled the amount of cost to $550 billion. Other groups who are more reputable and have a better reputation than the CBO, including Goldman Sachs, says it's a little over $1 trillion. And then you got the Cato Institute is saying it's almost $2 trillion in costs for all these green energy programs. So there's a lot of opportunity that a lot of money that we can save in order to help reconcile this budget. The other program is food stamps. Under the Obamacare, under Joe Biden's policies, he let states have waivers for food stamps. And so as a result, we have a lot of illegals that are getting food stamps. We have people people using the system for unhealthy food as well. So there's a lot of opportunities there that we can find savings. In fact, because of the Biden rules and the changes that he made, the spending on food stamps went from $64 billion before COVID to $110 billion, nearly doubling during the last, 5 years. So let's put this all into perspective. And this is what I thought would be the easiest way to explain this. We have a balancing act here. Reconciliation is really about reconciling the budget. And the tax proposals, the tax cuts have a cost. They have a weight, okay? And on this side of the scale, the cost of extending and making permanent the Trump tax cuts is estimated to be $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, I'm going to caveat that. 4.5 trillion, but they estimate that there's an economic growth. The economy is going to grow by 2.5 trillion. So the net cost is $2 trillion, okay? And that is before we do any of the SALT deduction relief, before we do the no taxes on tips or no taxes on overtime, no tax on Social Security. So we have to come up with, if we're going to reconcile, $2 trillion in spending cuts or savings in order to do just to extend the Trump tax cuts. Where do we get that? Here's the other side of the scale. So on this side, we find savings by from the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has found savings returning to pre-COVID era and Clinton era work requirements. We're able to find nearly $880 billion in savings in Medicaid. And the Ag Committee, through the food stamps, through conservation programs, we're able to find $230 billion in savings. And this is all over a 10-year period. The Ed and Workforce Committee, by repealing the free loans to the tuition forgiveness, by repealing that, we're able to save $330 billion. So if you add this all up, all of these savings, these proposed, and this is what these committees are proposing, it comes out to about 1.5. So it doesn't even come up to the $2 trillion that we need. So if this is going to balance, we have to find more in spending cuts or savings in order to pay for the Trump tax cuts, the SALT, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and Social Security. So that's where we're at. And what Washington, D.C., what's happening right now is Washington, D.C. is doing what it does best, which is funny math. So instead of saying that this score is 4.5 trillion, the way to balance this is to fake that number and make it whatever you want. And unfortunately, that appears to be where things are, which is why I can't support it. For me, if we do not reconcile and we end up exacerbating the deficit, according to CBO, even the current proposals will exacerbate the deficit and make the deficit even worse over the next couple of years before it gets better. This is something that I can't live with. And so that's where things are. I'm still hopeful. I want to support, and I want to get to a yes. I want to get to the point in which we can extend Trump's tax cuts, where we can have no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. And if we have to help out the New Yorkers and Californians, so be it. But these individuals need to be helping us find the savings to pay for their SALT tax relief. And so that's what's happening in a nutshell here in Washington, D.C. And so I just wanted to give that message to you. Hopefully you can share this, but appreciate everything you do. I'm Eric Burleson, your congressman, fighting for you.